The first thing every Hedda child learns is that the land has eyes, not just the obvious ones, the gleam of wolf reflections in darkness, the watchful gaze of ravens circling overhead, the steady stare of bears fishing in autumn streams. No, we learn of older eyes, ancient ones, that watched the first people walk these lands, that saw the great ice sheets retreat, that still keep vigil in the spaces between heartbeats. I learned this truth at my grandmother's knee, in a house that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, where shadows danced on walls hung with the tools of our ancestors. Her name was Anna, though the white people in town called her Anna. She wore her gray hair in 2 long braids and had hands textured like birch bark from decades of working traditional crafts. "Listen, Michael," she would say, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "Listen with more than your ears." She taught me to feel the world's pulse in the soles of my feet, to taste approaching weather on the back of my tongue, to sense the presence of others before they came into view. But of all her teachings, none struck deeper than the stories of the Wahila. "There are wolves," she would begin, her fingers working strips of moose hide as she spoke, "and then there is the Wahila." The way she said that name, half whisper, half prayer, made even the flames in our wood stove flicker. "The wolves hunt for food, for survival. The Wahila hunts for balance." She described a creature that walked the boundary between spirit and flesh, larger than any natural wolf, with fur that captured moonlight and eyes that held ancient wisdom. "Some say it came from the time when giants walked our lands," she would explain, "when the mammoth still thundered across the tundra and the ice ruled the world. Others believe it was born from the first agreement between our people and the spirit world, a guardian to watch over that sacred pact." My childhood was filled with such stories, but they weren't mere entertainment. Each tale carried a lesson, a warning, a map for navigating the complex relationship between our people and the land that sustained us. We learned that every action carried weight. Every choice echoed through the web of connections that bound all living things together. I grew up straddling 2 worlds. Our small community lay where the boreal forest met the tundra, a place of transition where the old ways still held power. But I also attended the public school in town, where teachers spoke of science and progress, where my classmates played video games and dreamed of cities. I learned to navigate both realities, to translate between them, to find balance. Brad walked this same path with me, at least at first. His family lived on the reservation's edge, close enough to be part of our community, but far enough to feel the constant pull of the outside world. We shared everything as children: fishing trips, summer camps, the first awkward ceremonies of approaching adulthood. His grandmother and mine were close friends, both respected elders who kept the old stories alive. But something changed during Brad's college years in Seattle. Each time he came home, he seemed more distant from our ways, more eager to prove he'd moved beyond what he started calling superstitions. He replaced his traditional name with an English one, stopped attending ceremonies, began to mock those who still followed the old practices. "We can't live in the past forever," he would argue, his voice carrying that edge of city sophistication. "The world's moving forward, and we need to move with it." Charlie, my younger brother, took a different path. While I split my time between construction work in Anchorage and our traditional lands, Charlie devoted himself to learning the deepest aspects of our culture. He became a guide for hunting parties, but more than that, he became a bridge between old and new. He could explain our traditions to outsiders in ways that made sense, could help them see the wisdom preserved in our practices. The morning Brad suggested the camping trip started like any other September day in Alaska. Frost crystallizing on window panes, ravens calling in the pre-dawn darkness, the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifting through my grandmother's house. I was helping her prepare traditional medicines, crushing dried herbs with a stone mortar that had belonged to her grandmother before her. Brad's arrival shattered the morning's peace like a stone through ice. He burst through the door without knocking, something he would never have done in the old days, tracking mud onto the hand-woven rugs that took my grandmother months to make. "Michael, you won't believe what I just got!" His voice was too loud for the sacred space of the medicine room, where we kept our traditional healing supplies. He held up a new camping tent, its bright synthetic fabric garish against the earthen tones of my grandmother's home. Latest model from REI. Ultra-light, waterproof, practically sets itself up. My grandmother's hand stilled over her work. She said nothing, but I saw her eyes track to the old ceremonial tent poles in the corner, blessed by generations of our family for safe journeys. "We should break this in," Brad continued, either missing or ignoring the tension his presence had created. "Your birthday's coming up, right? Let's get the old crew together. One night, up in the high country. No elders, no responsibilities, no ancient protocols to follow. Just us, some beers, and pure wilderness." I felt the weight of my grandmother's gaze, though she remained focused on her work. In our tradition, suggesting a celebration without proper ceremonies was like walking into another person's house without permission. Disrespectful at best, dangerous at worst. "Brad," I started, choosing my words carefully, "you know this isn't the season for..." "For what?" He cut me off, that new edge of mockery entering his voice. "For following rules set down by people who didn't have Gore-Tex and GPS? Come on, Michael. We're not kids anymore. We don't need permission slips from the spirit world to go camping." The mortar made a grinding sound as my grandmother set it down with deliberate care. She stood, her small frame somehow filling the room with authority, and walked to her medicine cabinet. Without speaking, she removed a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. "You plan to walk in the high places," she said, her accent thickening as it did when she spoke of important matters, "where the air grows thin and the spirits walk close to the ground." She held out the bundle to Brad. "Take this, an offering for safe passage." Brad's laugh had a cruel edge that made me wince. "Thanks, Anna, but I think we'll stick with modern safety equipment." He turned to me, dismissing her as if she were merely a quaint relic. "So, are you in? Charlie's already said yes." That surprised me. Charlie was usually the more cautious one when it came to tradition. I caught movement by the window. Maria, my girlfriend, had arrived silently as was her way. Her expression told me she'd heard enough to understand the situation. "When?" I asked, already knowing I would go, if only to keep Brad from doing something foolish. "Next weekend, your actual birthday. We'll head up to Thunder Basin, camp near the old hunting grounds." He grinned, not noticing how my grandmother's expression darkened at the mention of that place. Just one night of actual freedom. After he left, trailing muddy footprints and disrespect, my grandmother picked up her mortar again, but instead of returning to her medicines, she began grinding a different mixture, darker herbs, sacred plants used for protection. "He walks a dangerous path," she said quietly, "between what he was taught and what he chooses to forget." She looked up at me, her dark eyes holding generations of wisdom. "The land remembers, Michael. It remembers those who honor the old ways and those who mock them." Maria moved from the window to stand beside me. "I've heard stories about Thunder Basin," she said, her voice carrying the knowledge of her own tribe's teachings, "about what lives there, what hunts there." My grandmother nodded. "The Wendigo walks those heights," she confirmed, "and other things, older things." She began wrapping small bundles of the protective herbs in strips of hide. "If you must go, and I sense you must, take these, place them at the 4 directions around your camp, and remember what I taught you about the Wahila." "The great white wolf?" I asked, though I knew the stories by heart. "The guardian," she corrected. "The one who keeps the balance. It watches, it judges, and when necessary, it acts." She pressed the bundles into my hands, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Respect the old ways, even if others forget. The Wahila remembers who honors the traditions and who treats them like empty stories." The week before our trip passed in a haze of preparation and premonition. Every morning I woke to ravens gathering on the spruce trees outside my window. More each day, their calls carrying warnings only those trained in the old ways could understand. The weather shifted restlessly, bringing storms that didn't match the forecasts and cold snaps that felt more like January than September. I found Charlie at his workshop behind his house, maintaining the equipment he used for guiding winter hunting parties. His hands moved methodically over leather and steel while we talked. "Why did you agree to go?" I asked, watching him work. "You know Brad doesn't respect the traditions anymore." Charlie was quiet for a long moment, testing the edge of a knife against his thumb. "I had a dream," he finally said. 3 nights in a row, the same dream. Among our people, repeated dreams carry weight. They're considered messages from the spirit world, not to be ignored. "In the dream," he continued, "I'm standing in Thunder Basin. There's snow, but it's red, and I hear something calling, not with a voice, but with hunger." He set the knife down, meeting my eyes. Then I see Brad, walking toward something in the darkness, something waiting. And behind him, he shook his head. "That's when I wake up." "You think going with him might prevent whatever you're seeing?" "I think we need to be there." He picked up another knife, this one carved with protective symbols. "The elders say sometimes we're called to witness, even when we can't prevent." I helped him check the emergency gear: satellite phone, first aid supplies, flares. Everything double and triple checked, as our father had taught us. Charlie had added traditional items as well: sage for cleansing, tobacco for offerings, red ochre for protection. "Brad won't like those," I noted. "Brad doesn't have to like them, but they'll be there when needed." Maria found me later that day at my grandmother's house, where I was gathering my own supplies. She carried a small leather bag that smelled of herbs and smoke. "My grandmother made this," she said, placing it in my hands. "She says the spirits are restless. The signs aren't good for camping in the high country." The bag contained a mixture of protective herbs I recognized from both our traditions: sage, sweetgrass, cedar, and others meant to ward off dark influences. More importantly, it carried the prayers and power of generations of medicine women. "Thunder Basin," she said, watching me secure the bag to my belt. "Do you know why it has that name?" I did. The stories say it's not named for actual thunder, but for the sound made by something that hunts there. Something that calls with a voice like storm clouds breaking against mountains. "The Wendigo," she said, naming what we'd both been thinking. "My people have stories about them. They say they were once human, before hunger turned them into something else. Something that's always starving, always hunting, but can never be satisfied. Brad thinks those are just stories to scare children away from wandering too far alone." "Brad has forgotten that our stories are maps," she replied. "They show us where the dangers are and how to survive them." She touched the medicine bag at my belt. "Promise me you'll keep this close." The next few days were filled with practical preparations. I checked my camping gear methodically: tent, sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, multiple light sources, emergency shelter materials. I added things my father had insisted were essential: waterproof matches in sealed containers, multiple knives, cordage, water purification methods. But I also made preparations of another kind. Each morning before sunrise, I sat with my grandmother as she performed the traditional ceremonies for protection. She burned sacred herbs, sang the ancient songs, and told me again the stories I would need to remember. "The Wahila isn't just a wolf," she reminded me. "It's a judge, a balance keeper. When people forget their place in the natural order, it reminds them." Her hands moved through the smoke, shaping prayers. "But remember, it protects those who show respect, even if others around them don't." The night before our departure, I had my own dream. I stood in a snowy clearing, while around me the northern lights danced in colors I'd never seen before, deep reds and blues that seemed to pulse like heartbeats. In the dream, I heard something moving through the darkness beyond the lights, many somethings, and then I saw eyes, not the yellow eyes of natural wolves, but eyes like blue ice, ancient and knowing. I woke to the sound of ravens, hundreds of them, their calls filling the pre-dawn darkness with what sounded like laughter. The morning we left for Thunder Basin brought the kind of cold that old-timers call knife weather, sharp enough to cut through any number of layers. Our breath formed thick clouds in the pre-dawn darkness as we loaded the trucks. Brad arrived last, his new camping gear still pristine, price tags barely removed. "You guys pack like you're expecting the apocalypse," he laughed, tossing his lightweight bag into the truck bed. His preparation consisted of a small tent, some snacks, and what looked like enough alcohol to stock a small bar. Charlie did a final equipment check while I stored the emergency gear. Rather than argue with Brad about proper preparation, we'd simply packed extra supplies, something our father had taught us years ago. "Nature doesn't care if you're ready or not," he'd say. "It only cares if you survive." The drive to Thunder Basin took us through increasingly remote territory. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks barely wide enough for vehicles. The forest pressed in around us, old-growth spruce and hemlock creating tunnels of shadow even in daylight. "This area's had some strange incidents lately," Charlie mentioned casually, though I knew nothing he said was ever truly casual. "Couple of hikers went missing last month. Search and rescue found their camp, but no sign of them." Brad snorted from the back seat. "Probably got drunk and wandered off. Happens all the time." "Their gear was all there," Charlie continued, "including their boots. Nobody wanders far in Alaska without boots." I caught his meaning. He was trying to warn Brad without triggering his automatic rejection of traditional cautions. Our people knew that Thunder Basin demanded respect. Its weather patterns could change in minutes. Its terrain could disorient even experienced hikers, and its resident predators had never learned to fear humans. The last few miles required careful navigation. Recent rains had turned parts of the track into mud slicks, and more than once we had to work together to keep the trucks from sliding off the narrow path. Brad's mood soured as his new hiking boots disappeared under layers of muck. We reached the basin itself by early afternoon. Thunder Basin earned its name from the way sound echoed off its curved walls, amplifying even small noises into rolling rumbles. The place had a natural amphitheater effect that played tricks with hearing. Voices could carry for unexpected distances, while important sounds like approaching footsteps might be swallowed entirely. As we unloaded the trucks, I noticed fresh tracks in the mud, large canine prints that made Charlie pause when he saw them. Not unusual for Alaska, but these were bigger than typical wolf tracks, and they showed an unusual gait pattern. "Looks like we've got company," Charlie said quietly, kneeling to examine the prints more closely. "Big one, too. Probably best if we keep the food secured and maintain a good fire tonight." Brad was already cracking his first beer, oblivious to the tracks or their implications. "This is perfect," he called out, his voice bouncing off the basin walls in unsettling echoes. "Let's set up over there, by that clearing." The clearing he pointed to was exposed, away from the natural shelter of the basin's walls. Any hunter would know it was a poor choice, too open to weather, too exposed to observation from the ridgeline above. But before we could suggest a better spot, Brad was already dragging his tent toward it. Maria caught my eye and nodded toward another set of tracks leading into the underbrush. Human prints, relatively fresh, made by boots with an unusual tread pattern. Someone else was using the basin, or had been recently. In itself not alarming, but combined with the missing hikers Charlie had mentioned. We set up our own camp in a more defensible position, close enough to Brad to keep an eye on him, but better situated against the elements. The afternoon light was already taking on that peculiar autumn quality that makes shadows seem solid enough to touch, and the temperature was dropping faster than normal for this time of year. Going to be a cold one, Charlie observed, efficiently setting up his tent with the practice of a professional guide. Hope everyone packed proper sleeping gear. Brad's response was to pull out more beer. That's what this is for, he grinned, already showing signs of intoxication. Nature's antifreeze. I caught a glimpse of movement on the ridgeline above us. Just a shadow, really, but enough to make me grateful for the rifle Charlie had insisted on bringing. Alaska's wilderness doesn't forgive poor planning, and at that moment, watching Brad stumble around our campsite, I had a feeling we'd need every precaution we'd taken. Dusk arrived early, as it always does in Alaskan autumn. Brad had consumed most of his beer supply, becoming increasingly loud and careless. His voice echoed off the basin walls, carrying far into the wilderness, breaking the first rule of survival in predator country: don't announce your presence. The temperature dropped sharply as darkness fell. The cold seemed to crawl up from the ground itself, seeping through our boots and making the air crystallize in our lungs. Brad's lightweight tent already showed signs of strain, its cheap fabric struggling against the strengthening wind. Maybe we should move him closer to our camp, Charlie suggested quietly as we gathered firewood. That clearing's too exposed. Before I could respond, Brad's voice cut through the gathering darkness. Hey, check this out! He stood at the edge of the clearing, pointing his flashlight beam at something in the trees. Looks like somebody left their gear. We found a camping setup abandoned mid-use, a high-end tent partially collapsed, expensive equipment scattered around as if its owner had left in a hurry. Charlie examined the site with professional attention, noting details I might have missed. No signs of animal attack, no blood or struggle, just abandonment. This is recent, he said, touching the tent fabric. Maybe a day old, maybe less. Brad's accident happened just before midnight. He'd been showing off, walking along a fallen log despite our warnings about ice. His head struck a rock with a sound that echoed through the basin like a gunshot. Charlie took charge immediately, checking vitals while I grabbed the first aid kit. The cut wasn't deep, but in the wilderness, any injury can become serious. The others decided to drive him to the nearest hospital, leaving me to pack up the camp. That's when I first heard it. Footsteps in the darkness, too deliberate to be an animal, too heavy to be someone from our group returning. The sound circled the camp, staying just beyond the firelight. I kept the fire high and my rifle close, remembering all those missing hiker reports. The tracks we'd seen earlier took on new significance. Someone else was out here, someone who knew how to move in darkness, someone watching and waiting. The whispering started around 3 a.m. A hoarse voice carried on the wind, calling my name. It had to be someone who'd overheard our conversations earlier, someone who'd been watching us long enough to learn who we were. The fire was dying despite my efforts. Each time I rebuilt it, the wind seemed to shift, driving smoke into my eyes. The voice grew closer, its owner moving with the kind of patience that only comes from experience in stalking prey. Then I saw the wolf. It emerged from the shadows like a ghost, massive, white-furred, unlike any I'd seen before. But it moved with purpose, positioning itself between me and something in the darkness beyond. The confrontation happened fast. A figure burst from the tree line. A man, but moving like an animal covered in mud and fur. He carried a crude spear and wore what looked like pieces of previous victims' camping gear. The wolf, the real wolf, attacked without hesitation. What followed was pure violence, over in seconds. The man fell, struck his head, and didn't move again. When I carefully approached, I found maps on his body showing other campsites, other victims. Later, search and rescue would identify him as someone long suspected in multiple disappearances, a survivalist gone feral, hunting people in the wilderness he'd claimed as his territory. The morning brought rangers, helicopters, and explanations. The Wendigo was just a man, driven mad by isolation and whatever darkness he'd carried into the wilderness. The guardian spirit was a rare white wolf, probably drawn to the area by the intruder's activities. Brad recovered in the hospital, humbled by the experience. The incident report mentioned a survivalist, a territorial wolf, and lucky survivors. But my grandmother nodded when I told her the full story, understanding how nature itself sometimes restores balance. The wilderness teaches its own lessons. Sometimes they come dressed in legend, sometimes in simple truth, but they always come with teeth. College life is a whirlwind of experiences, a time when we're supposed to find ourselves, explore our passions, and maybe even make a difference in the world. When my friend Carlos and I signed up for a filmmaking class, we thought it would be a fun break from the usual grind of lectures and essays. Little did we know that our simple class project would lead us into the heart of darkness, forever changing the way we viewed the world and ourselves. The assignment was straightforward enough: create a short documentary on a topic of our choosing. But Carlos and I, ever the overachievers, wanted to do something more. We wanted to create a film that would stand out, that would challenge people's perceptions, and maybe even uncover a truth hidden beneath layers of myth and superstition. And that's how we found ourselves in the middle of a supposedly cursed forest, just a stone's throw from our college town, armed with nothing but a camera and a naive sense of invincibility. The forest had always been there, a dark presence lurking on the edge of town, whispered about in hushed tones and cautionary tales. The stories about the place went back generations, woven into the very fabric of local folklore. They said that the native tribes who once called this land home believed the forest to be sacred ground, a place where the veil between worlds was thin and spirits walked among the living. But as time passed and the world changed, the stories took on a darker tone. Tales of ghosts and demons, of dark rituals and unspeakable horrors began to circulate. People started to avoid the forest, and those few who dared to venture in often came back changed, speaking of a malevolent energy that permeated the very air. I'd always been a skeptic, dismissing such stories as mere superstition and campfire tales. Carlos, too, scoffed at the idea of a cursed forest. We were men of science, of reason, and we believed that every mystery had a logical explanation. And so, when we learned of the legend of the cursed forest, we knew we had found the perfect subject for our documentary. We would venture into those dark woods, peel back the layers of myth and folklore, and expose the truth for all to see. The day we set out to film was perfect, the kind of crisp, clear autumn day that seems to exist only in memory. As we drove to the edge of the forest, the sun dappled the changing leaves in shades of gold and crimson, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of decay. It was beautiful, in a melancholy sort of way, and for a moment I almost forgot the purpose of our journey. But as we stepped into the forest proper, a strange stillness seemed to settle over us. The trees, tall and imposing, seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We spent the first few hours filming, capturing the eerie beauty of the place, the play of light through the dense canopy, the rich carpet of fallen leaves, the yawning mouths of caves that dotted the landscape. It was easy to see how such a place could inspire stories of the supernatural, but to us, it was just another forest, a piece of nature to be documented and demystified. But then we found the cave. It wasn't a particularly large or deep cave, but something about it drew us in. Perhaps it was the way the light seemed to bend around its entrance, or the strange, almost electrical charge that seemed to hang in the air. Whatever the reason, we knew we had to film inside. As we set up our equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sun, which had been shining brightly just moments before, seemed to retreat behind a veil of clouds, casting the forest in an eerie half-light. The sounds of the forest, too, seemed to fade away, until all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. That's when Carlos heard it. A sound from outside the cave, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. We had heard the wind all day, but this was different. This was deliberate, purposeful. This was the sound of something approaching. We froze, straining our ears to catch the sound again. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, clear as day, the footsteps resumed, growing closer with each passing second before fading away again, as if whatever was out there was toying with us, circling our position. I could see the fear in Carlos's eyes, mirroring my own rising panic. We had laughed off the stories, but now, in the oppressive stillness of that cave, it was hard to dismiss the feeling that we were not alone. We hastily packed up our gear, trying to maintain an air of composure even as our hands shook and our hearts raced. As we emerged from the cave, the forest seemed darker than it should have been, the shadows deeper and more menacing. With every step we took towards the car, the sense of dread grew, a physical weight pressing down on us. And then we heard it again. The footsteps, louder now and coming fast. We ran. There was no thought, no plan, just the primal instinct to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and whatever was out there. The forest was a blur around us, branches whipping at our faces and roots trying to twist our ankles. But we ran on, driven by a terror that defied reason. Behind us, the footsteps grew louder, closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw them. 2 dark figures, moving through the trees with a speed and agility that seemed impossible. They were gaining on us, their shapes blurred by the shadows and the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. We burst from the tree line, stumbling into the small clearing where we had parked the car. Relief surged through me at the sight of it, a lifeline in this nightmare. But as we fumbled with the doors, hands shaking so badly we could barely grip the handles, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tires were flat. All of them. I stuck my head out to look, and the sight confirmed my fears. The tires hadn't just gone flat. They had been slashed, the rubber hanging in ragged strips from the rims. And then I saw them, emerging from the trees like wraiths, walking slowly towards us with a purposeful, almost leisurely gait. There were 3 of them, dressed in black from head to toe, their faces hidden behind featureless masks. As they drew closer, I could see that one of them was smaller, more slightly built, with delicate hands that glittered with nail polish. It was a detail that should have been insignificant, but somehow it made the situation even more surreal, more terrifying. Carlos was on the phone, his voice high and tight with panic, as he tried to explain our situation to the emergency operator. But the signal was weak out here, and the call kept dropping, his words fading into static. We were on our own. They surrounded the car, their masked faces pressing up against the windows, their breath fogging the glass. One of them, the smaller one with the painted nails, began to pound on the window, the blows growing harder and harder until I feared the glass would shatter. And through it all, I could hear them laughing, a sound that chilled me to the bone. Just when I thought the window would give way, when I had almost resigned myself to whatever horrible fate awaited us, I saw the lights, blue and red, flashing through the trees, growing brighter by the second. The sound of a siren cut through the laughter, and our attackers froze, their heads turning towards the approaching vehicle. It was a park ranger, his face a mix of concern and confusion as he pulled up beside us. At the sight of him, our assailants fled, melting back into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. We were safe, but the ordeal was far from over. The hours that followed were a blur of police interviews and medical checks, of trying to put into words the sheer, visceral terror of what we had experienced. We learned that they had caught one of our attackers, a man with roses tattooed on his face, and a chilling lack of remorse in his eyes. But the other 2 remained at large, their identities and motives a mystery. In the end, our documentary was never finished. The footage we had captured sat untouched on our hard drives, a reminder of a truth we couldn't bring ourselves to face, because the reality was, the forest wasn't cursed. There were no ghosts or demons lurking in those woods. The monsters, it turned out, were all too human. But that truth, if anything, was even more terrifying, because it meant that the darkness we had encountered that day wasn't confined to some remote patch of woods. It was out there in the world, walking among us in broad daylight. It was in the empty eyes of a stranger on the street, in the casual cruelty of a passerby. It was a part of the human condition, as inescapable as the air we breathed. It's been years since that day in the woods, but the memories haven't faded. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I can still hear the crunch of those footsteps, still feel the cold touch of fear on the back of my neck. Carlos and I don't talk much about what happened, but I know it's always there, a shadow hanging over us. We learned a lot from that experience, about the world and about ourselves. We learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to face it head on. We learned that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we'd like to believe, and that the real monsters don't always hide in the dark. But most of all, we learned that the truth is a double-edged sword. It can set you free, but it can also cut you to the bone. And sometimes, when you stare too long into the abyss stares back. So we go on, Carlos and I, carrying the weight of what we know. We finish our degrees, start our careers, build our lives. But a part of us will always be back in those woods, running for our lives, confronting the darkness within and without. Because once you've seen the truth, there's no going back. There's only forward, into an uncertain future, with the knowledge that the monsters are real, and they walk among us. The crisp autumn air bit at my skin as I stepped out onto the porch, my eyes scanning the darkening sky. It was a chilly evening in 1982, and the wind whispered through the trees surrounding our rural home. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me ever since my father had shared a story from his past, a tale that had haunted him for years. I was in my early 20s then, having recently moved back home after a stint in the city. The transition from urban life to our quiet wooded property had been jarring, but there was something comforting about being back where I grew up. As I stood there, lost in thought, my father joined me on the porch, his weathered hands clutching a steaming mug of coffee. "Thinking about that story again?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, turning to face him. In the fading light, I could see the lines etched deep into his face, each one a testament to the years of hard work and worry he'd endured. But there was something else there, too, a shadow that crossed his features whenever he spoke of that night. "Tell me again," I urged, even though I knew every detail by heart. Something about hearing it from him made it feel more real, more immediate. He sighed, taking a long sip of his coffee before setting the mug down on the porch railing. "It was a night much like this one," he began, his eyes growing distant as he cast his mind back. "Your aunt had come down from Toronto to visit. She left around 9 p.m., but her car broke down about 7 miles from here." I listened intently, even though I knew what was coming. The way he told it, I could almost see it happening. My aunt's car sputtering to a stop in front of a family friend's house, the relief on her face when they offered to let her use their phone. "I drove down to pick her up," my father continued. "She decided to stay the night with us and deal with the car in the morning. It was after 10 p.m. by the time we started heading back home." He paused then, his hands gripping the porch railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. I waited, knowing he was steeling himself for what came next. "We were driving through that stretch of woods, you know the one, about halfway between here and town, when we heard it. A scream like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It was inhuman," loud enough to drown out the radio, the engine, everything. I shivered, not entirely from the cold. I'd driven that road countless times, but ever since hearing this story, it had taken on a sinister quality in my mind. I slammed on the brakes, my father went on, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Your aunt and I were both freaking out, trying to figure out what the hell we just heard. And then, we saw it. He fell silent for a long moment, his eyes focused on something far away. I waited, holding my breath. It was at the edge of the headlights, just off to the side of the road. At first I thought it was a coyote, but it was standing on its hind legs, and it was huge, at least 7 feet tall. Its tail, I'll never forget that tail. Black and white stripes, like something out of a nightmare. I'd heard this description many times, but it never failed to send a chill down my spine. The image it conjured was too bizarre, too wrong to be real, and yet the fear in my father's eyes was all too genuine. It walked across the road in front of the car, he continued. Just calmly walked across on 2 legs like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then it disappeared into the woods on the other side. That's when we heard the scream again, even louder this time, like it was right next to the car. We got out of there as fast as we could. As he finished his story, we both fell into a contemplative silence. The darkness had fully settled in now, the woods around our house a black void punctuated only by the faint glow of our porch light. You really think it was a skinwalker? I asked, voicing the question that had been on my mind ever since I first heard the tale. My father shrugged, picking up his now cold coffee. I don't know what it was. All I know is what I saw and what I heard, and I hope to God I never see or hear anything like it again. With that, he turned and went back into the house, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the endless darkness of the forest. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind. I'd grown up hearing stories of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches from Navajo legend, but I'd always dismissed them as just that, stories. Now, faced with my father's unwavering belief in what he'd seen, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I found myself growing increasingly obsessed with my father's encounter. I scoured the internet for similar stories, pored over books on cryptozoology and Native American folklore, and even reached out to local historians to see if they'd heard of any similar incidents in the area. My search yielded little concrete information, but it did uncover a pattern of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena in the region stretching back decades. There were reports of unusually large bipedal animals, eerie screams in the night, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to permeate certain areas of the forest. One afternoon, while helping my father clear some brush from the edge of our property, I decided to broach the subject again. Dad, I began hesitantly, have you ever thought about going back to that spot? You know, where you saw it? He paused in his work, leaning on his rake as he considered my question. Why would I want to do that? He asked, his tone guarded. I shrugged, trying to appear casual. I don't know, closure maybe? Or to see if there's any evidence of something unusual in the area? My father's expression darkened. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and serious. There are some things in this world that we're not meant to understand. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't natural, and it's best left alone. His words should have discouraged me, but they only fueled my curiosity. That night, after my parents had gone to bed, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I grabbed a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook, and slipped out of the house. The night was cool and clear, a full moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As I drove towards the spot where my father had his encounter, my heart pounded in my chest, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through my veins. The stretch of road where it happened was unremarkable in the daylight, just another wooded section of highway. But at night, it took on a different character. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Every shadow held the potential for something other. I parked my car on the shoulder and stepped out, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. For hours I wandered the area, searching for, I wasn't even sure what, unusual tracks, tufts of fur, anything that might corroborate my father's story. But the forest kept its secrets close. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I reluctantly headed back to my car. I was tired, cold, and no closer to answers than when I'd started. But as I reached for the door handle, a sound froze me in place. A scream, distant but unmistakable. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between. The sound seemed to go on forever, rising and falling in pitch, until it suddenly cut off. I stood there, my heart racing, straining my ears for any further noise. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest. With shaking hands, I got into my car and drove home, my mind reeling. I had heard it, the same sound my father had described. It was real. From that night on, my obsession grew. I began spending more and more time in the woods, always under the guise of hiking or nature photography. I set up trail cameras, collected soil samples, and interviewed locals about any strange experiences they might have had. My parents grew concerned about my newfound fascination with the forest. They couldn't understand why I was suddenly spending so much time outdoors, often returning home late at night, muddy and exhausted. "You need to be careful out there," my mother warned one evening as I was preparing to head out again. "The woods can be dangerous, especially at night." If only she knew the half of it. As the months passed, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest. Areas that had once been teeming with wildlife now stood eerily silent. I found strange markings on trees, deep gouges that couldn't have been made by any normal animal. And always there was that feeling of being watched, of something just beyond the edge of my vision. It was on a crisp autumn evening, almost exactly a year after my first nighttime excursion, that everything changed. I was deep in the woods, farther than I'd ever ventured before. The sun had set hours ago, and I was relying on my flashlight and the faint glow of the moon to navigate. As I picked my way through a particularly dense patch of underbrush, my foot caught on something, sending me sprawling to the ground. Cursing under my breath, I turned to see what had tripped me. What I saw made my blood run cold. Half buried in the leaf litter was a bone, a large bone, too large to belong to any animal native to these woods. With trembling hands, I brushed away the leaves, revealing more bones, a rib cage, a pelvis, a skull. The skull was the most disturbing part. It was clearly animal in origin, but wrong somehow. The eye sockets were too large, the jaw too elongated. And the teeth, row upon row of sharp serrated teeth, more like a shark's than any land animal I'd ever seen. As I crouched there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, at the edge of the light, stood a figure. For a moment, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, easily 7 feet or more, and covered in a patchwork of fur and what looked like scales. Its legs were bent backward, like a dog's hind legs, ending in massive, clawed feet. But it was the face that truly horrified me. It was a twisted amalgamation of coyote and human features. The snout was elongated, filled with teeth that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. But the eyes were disturbingly human, filled with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Then, slowly, deliberately, its mouth opened. What came out was the same scream I had heard a year ago, that unearthly howl that was neither human nor animal. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or safety. Behind me, I could hear it giving chase, its footfalls shaking the very ground. I don't know how long I ran, or how I found my way back to my car. All I know is that somehow I made it. As I sped away, my headlights caught a glimpse of something standing at the edge of the road, a tall, impossible figure that seemed to shimmer and shift in the darkness. When I finally made it home, I was a mess, covered in cuts and bruises, my clothes torn and muddy. My parents were frantic, demanding to know what had happened. But how could I explain? How could I tell them that the monster from Dad's story was real, and that I had seen it with my own eyes? In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, a product of too many sleepless nights and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had seen was real as the bone-chilling scream that now haunted my dreams. I never went back into those woods, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that scream again, drifting on the breeze, a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. As the years passed, I tried to put that night behind me. I moved away, started a family, built a life far from those dark woods. But the memory never faded. It lingered, always there in the back of my mind, coloring how I saw the world. I became a writer, channeling my experiences into fiction stories of the unknown and the unexplainable. My readers praised my vivid imagination, never knowing that my most terrifying tales were rooted in truth. It wasn't until my own child was born that I truly understood my father's reluctance to speak about what he'd seen. As I held my newborn, I realized that there are some truths too heavy, too dangerous to pass on. Some mysteries that are better left unsolved. But still, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking back to those woods, to the creature I saw, to the scream that still echoes in my nightmares. And I wonder, what else is out there, lurking in the shadows just beyond the edge of what we know? I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Not my wife, not my friends, not even my own child. But sometimes when I look into the darkness at the edge of our property, I catch myself listening, waiting. For what, I'm not sure. Maybe one day, when my child is older, I'll find the courage to share my story, to pass on the knowledge that the world is stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine. But for now, I keep my secret, and I watch the shadows, always aware that something might be watching back. And so, life goes on. I wake each morning, go about my day and try to forget. But in the quiet moments when the world grows still and the shadows deepen, I remember. I remember the creature in the woods, the impossible skull half buried in the leaves, and the scream that shattered the night. I remember, and I wonder, what if it remembers me too? It may not be a long story or even a great one, but it's a tale that has haunted me for the past 26 years. As a construction worker for most of my life, I'm not much of a storyteller, so bear with me as I recount this unsettling experience from my childhood. When I was 14, my parents bought me a pup tent for my monthly Boy Scout campouts. It was a necessity, as several of the high school kids had left me covered in bruises during the previous year's outings. The tent was a dark green A-frame style, about 6 feet long and 3 feet high, with a zippered mosquito net cover at the entrance, one down the middle and one on each side. A rain cover could be tied over the tent with 2 sets of binding straps. On our camping trips, the first task was always to clear the area of debris, such as sticks and long grass. We used lawn mowers from the Scoutmaster's trailer to cut down the overgrowth. After my first day out, I set up my little tent about 15 to 20 feet away from the large 8-person tents where the other kids slept. I crawled into my tent, barely able to sit upright or turn around without hitting the sides. I zipped up my blue summer sleeping bag, ensured my camping pack was by my feet, and drifted off to sleep, feeling a sense of safety and seclusion in my private space. Little did I know, that sense of security was about to be shattered in the most terrifying way imaginable. It was the middle of the night when I was jolted awake by the sound of someone messing with the zipper on my tent. The brand new zipper's distinctive sound was enough to rouse me from my slumber, and I immediately felt a sense of unease wash over me. Who could be trying to enter my tent at this hour, and for what purpose? With my heart pounding in my chest, I grabbed my mini mag light with my right hand and sat up, flashing the beam towards the entrance by my feet. What I saw in that moment defied all logic and reason, and has haunted me ever since. There, with her head and shoulders inside my tent, was a girl rummaging through my backpack. At least I assumed it was a girl, based on the cleavage visible above my size 12 feet, which obscured her chest. But as I took in more details, I realized that this was no ordinary intruder. The creature's skin was a sickly pale green, and its hair, a deeper forest green, was tied back in what I can only describe as dreadlocks. Upon closer inspection, I noticed that there seemed to be ivy leaves tangled in its hair, adding to its otherworldly appearance. Its face, while traditionally beautiful, was marred by cat-like pupils set in brown eyes and dark, almost black lips. The moment I sat up with my light, the creature bared its teeth and let out a bone-chilling hiss. Those teeth, I'll never forget them. They weren't human teeth, but rather long and sharp, like those of a wild dog. In a flash, the creature pulled itself out of my tiny tent and vanished into the night. I tried to give chase, but by the time I untangled myself from my sleeping bag and crawled out of the tent, it was long gone. The only evidence of its presence was the missing snacks I had hidden in my backpack. From that night on, I slept with the rest of the kids in the big tents, using my pup tent to store extra gear and backpacks. I know it's not the most exciting story, and the whole experience lasted less than 2 minutes, but it has left a lasting impact on me. Since then, I've always been wary of the secrets that nature might hold. I don't often share this story, as I doubt many would believe such a bizarre tale. But the memory of that encounter has stayed with me, a constant reminder that there may be more to this world than we can explain. As the years passed, I tried to rationalize what I had seen that night. Perhaps it was just a strange dream, a product of my overactive teenage imagination. Or maybe it was a prank, orchestrated by the older scouts to scare the younger kids. But deep down I knew that neither of those explanations could account for the vivid details that were seared into my memory. The creature's unearthly appearance, the way it moved with a fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying, and those haunting eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. These were not the hallmarks of a mere dream or a well-executed prank. No, what I had witnessed that night was something far more sinister, something that defied the laws of nature as I understood them. As I grew older and began to work in construction, I found myself drawn to the solitude of the job sites. There was something comforting about being surrounded by the raw materials of the earth, the solid foundations and sturdy walls that we built from the ground up. It was a world that made sense to me, a world where everything had its place and purpose. But even as I lost myself in the rhythms of my work, I could never quite shake the memory of that night in the woods. It lingered at the edges of my consciousness, a constant reminder of the unknown that lurked just beyond the boundaries of our carefully constructed reality. I began to research the area where we had been camping, delving into the local history and folklore in search of any clues that might shed light on what I had seen. I pored over old maps and records, looking for any mention of strange occurrences or unexplained sightings in the region. At first I found nothing. The woods where we had camped were unremarkable, just another patch of wilderness in a vast sea of green. But as I dug deeper, I began to uncover whispers and rumors that hinted at a darker history. There were tales of settlers who had gone missing in those woods, never to be seen again. Stories of strange lights and eerie noises that echoed through the night, and of creatures that lurked in the shadows, waiting to prey on the unwary. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that what I had seen that night was not an isolated incident, but rather a glimpse into a world that existed just beyond the veil of our own. A world where the rules of nature did not apply, and where ancient primal forces held sway. I became obsessed with the idea of returning to those woods, of confronting the creature that had haunted my dreams for so long. I knew it was foolish, that I was risking my life and my sanity on a quest that might ultimately prove futile. But I could not resist the pull of the unknown, the desire to see for myself what lay hidden in the depths of the forest. And so, on a cool autumn night, 26 years after that fateful camping trip, I found myself back in those woods, my old pup tent strapped to my back and a sense of grim determination in my heart. I had come prepared this time, armed with a powerful flashlight, a sturdy knife, and a camera to document whatever I might find. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the eerie stillness of the forest at night. The only light came from the moon overhead, filtering down through the canopy of leaves in a pale, ghostly glow. I set up my tent in the same spot where I had camped all those years ago, my hands trembling slightly as I hammered in the stakes. I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me, the memories of that terrifying encounter flooding back in vivid detail. As I sat in my tent, waiting for the night to deepen, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. What if the creature was still out there, waiting for me? What if it had grown stronger, more vicious over the years? I had no way of knowing what I was up against, and the thought filled me with a sense of dread. But I had come too far to turn back now. I had to see this through, no matter the cost. As the hours ticked by, I found myself drifting off to sleep, my exhaustion finally catching up with me. But just as I was on the verge of unconsciousness, I heard a sound that snapped me back to full alertness. It was the sound of a zipper slowly being pulled open. My heart pounding in my chest, I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my hands shaking as I pointed the beam towards the entrance of my tent. And there, just as I had seen all those years ago, was the creature, its head and shoulders inside my tent, its eyes glinting in the darkness. But this time I was ready for it. With a shout of rage and fear, I lunged forward, my knife flashing in the moonlight. The creature hissed and recoiled, its claws raking across my arm as it tried to fend me off. But I was relentless, driven by a fury that had been building inside me for 26 years. We grappled in the darkness, the creature's strength nearly overwhelming me. But I fought back with everything I had, my knife finding its mark again and again. And then, with a final desperate thrust, I felt the blade sink deep into the creature's chest, and it let out a shriek of agony that seemed to echo through the entire forest. As I watched, the creature's form began to shift and change, its green skin fading to a sickly gray, its features twisting and contorting in a grotesque display. And then, with a final shudder, it collapsed to the ground, its body dissolving into a putrid mass of leaves and vines. I stared at the remains of the creature, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. And then, as if in a dream, I heard a voice, soft and ethereal, whispering in my ear. "Thank you," it said, "for setting me free." I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. Just the empty forest and the fading echo of those final words. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened that night in the woods. I pored over the photos I had taken of the creature's remains, searching for any clues that might help me understand its true nature. But the more I looked, the more questions I had. Who or what was the creature I had fought? Was it some kind of forest spirit, A guardian of the woods that had been corrupted by some dark force? Or was it something else entirely? A being from another world that had somehow found its way into ours? I may never know the answer to those questions, but one thing I do know is that the experience changed me in ways I could never have imagined. It opened my eyes to the possibility of a world beyond our own, a world where the boundaries between reality and myth are far more fluid than we might like to believe. And it also showed me the power of facing our fears, of confronting the demons that haunt us and refusing to let them control our lives. For 26 years, I had been running from the memory of that night in the woods, letting it shape my thoughts and actions in ways I barely even realized. But now, having faced the creature head-on and emerged victorious, I feel a sense of liberation, a newfound strength and resilience that I never knew I possessed. It's as if a weight has been lifted from my shoulders, and I can finally move forward with my life, unencumbered by the ghosts of my past. Of course, I know that not everyone will believe my story. After all, it sounds like something straight out of a horror movie or a campfire tale. But I know what I saw, and I know the impact it has had on me. And so I continue to work in construction, building the structures that shape our world and provide shelter and security for those who need it. But I also keep a watchful eye on the wilderness that surrounds us, knowing that there are secrets and mysteries out there that we have only begun to glimpse. Perhaps one day I will return to those woods, armed with the knowledge and experience I have gained over the years. Perhaps I will find answers to the questions that still haunt me. Or perhaps I will simply lose myself in the beauty and majesty of the natural world. But no matter what the future holds, I will always carry with me the memory of that night and the creature that changed my life forever. It is a part of me now, a reminder of the strange and wondrous world that lies just beyond the edge of our understanding. And who knows? Maybe, just maybe, there are others out there who have had similar experiences, who have caught a glimpse of the unknown and lived to tell the tale. If so, I hope that my story can serve as a beacon of hope and strength, a reminder that we are not alone in this world, and that there is always a way to overcome even the darkest of fears. As for me, I will continue to live my life to the fullest, to embrace the challenges and opportunities that come my way, and to never let the shadows of the past hold me back. For in the end, that is all any of us can do, to face our demons head on, and to emerge stronger, wiser, and more alive than ever before. In the 26 years since that fateful night, I have learned to live with the weight of my experience, to carry it with me as a badge of honor rather than a burden of shame. It has made me who I am today, a survivor, a seeker of truth, and a believer in the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of challenges. And so, I will continue to tell my story, to share it with those who are willing to listen and to learn from it. For in the end, that is the greatest gift we can give to one another, the gift of our experiences, our triumphs, and our struggles. May we all have the courage to face our fears, to confront the unknown, and to emerge stronger and more alive than ever before. For in the end, that is the true measure of our humanity, and the key to unlocking the mysteries of the world around us. The scorching Arizona sun had barely dipped below the horizon when my young cousin and I set out on what was supposed to be an exciting nighttime adventure. Little did I know that this seemingly innocent expedition would lead to an encounter that would haunt me for years to come. I'd always been fascinated by maps, finding comfort in the orderly representation of chaotic landscapes. During our family camping trip, this passion had manifested in a crude but comprehensive map of the desert surrounding our campground, lovingly crafted by my cousin and me over the past few days. As twilight settled over the arid landscape, transforming the familiar terrain into a realm of shadows and mystery, We decided to put our cartographic skills to the test. The desert at night is a different world entirely. The oppressive heat of the day gives way to a bone-chilling cold, and the once harsh landscape softens under the gentle caress of moonlight. And what moonlight it was! A full moon hanging low and heavy in the sky, casting an otherworldly glow over the sandy expanse. City dwellers can scarcely imagine the brightness of a full desert moon. It bathes everything in a silvery radiance that turns the familiar strange and the strange familiar. As we prepared for our nocturnal expedition, my grandfather pressed something into my hands, a wooden sword he had crafted himself. It was a thing of beauty, its surface adorned with carefully carved spikes that glinted menacingly in the moonlight. "Just in case," he'd said with a wink, his weathered face creasing into a smile. At the time, I'd thought it was overkill. What danger could we possibly face in this empty expanse? But I accepted it gratefully, the weight of the weapon oddly comforting in my grip. We set out with the confidence of youth, our makeshift map clutched in my cousin's hands as we navigated the moonlit terrain. The desert was alive with nocturnal sounds, the rustle of wind through scrub brush, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of sand shifting beneath our feet. Every shadow seemed to pulse with hidden life, but the bright moonlight and the reassuring presence of my grandfather's sword kept fear at bay. About half a mile from camp, we came upon the wash. To the uninitiated, a desert wash might seem like nothing more than a depression in the earth, but those familiar with the rhythms of the desert know better. These dry riverbeds, carved by infrequent but intense rainfall, are the lifeblood of the desert ecosystem. Some are mere trickles in the sand, while others, like the one before us, yawn wide enough to swallow a house. As we descended into the wash, our earlier bravado began to waver. The moonlight, so bright on the open desert, seemed to dim here, swallowed by the deeper shadows cast by the wash's high walls. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the musty scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation, smells that seemed out of place in the arid landscape. Our first discovery in the wash was macabre but fascinating: the skeletal remains of a falcon, picked clean by scavengers and bleached white by the unforgiving sun. We christened it Anakin, a nod to the ill-fated Jedi, its broken form a stark reminder of the harsh realities of desert life. The discovery renewed our excitement, and we pressed on, our young minds buzzing with the thrill of exploration. For nearly 20 minutes, we wandered the twisting course of the wash, our makeshift map proving surprisingly accurate as we navigated its serpentine path. The walls of the wash rose high on either side, creating an almost claustrophobic sense of enclosure that stood in stark contrast to the open expanse of the desert above. It was then that we came upon a section where the walls curved inward, creating a narrow passage that was barely noticeable at first glance. The change was subtle, a few feet at most, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. As we approached this constricted section of the wash, an overwhelming sense of dread seized me. Every instinct screamed danger, urging me to flee, to abandon my cousin and race back to the safety of our campsite. It was a primal fear, the kind that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to the lizard brain, triggering that most basic of responses: fight or flight. I fought against the urge to run, instead reaching out to grasp my cousin's arm. "We should head back," I said, my voice sounding strained and unfamiliar to my own ears. To mask my fear, I began rambling about a video game character, my words tumbling out in a nervous stream as we turned and began retracing our steps. We had only gone a few paces when that feeling of wrongness intensified, growing so strong that it stopped me in my tracks. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned back toward the narrowed section of the wash. What I saw in that moment defies easy description, and even now, safe and far removed from that night, I struggle to put it into words. Standing precisely where the wash walls curved inward, was a figure that at first glance might have been mistaken for a man. But any resemblance to humanity vanished upon closer inspection. The creature, for I can think of no better term, was impossibly tall, its height difficult to gauge in the deceptive moonlight, but certainly no less than 7 feet. Its body appeared to be hairless, its skin a pallid gray that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the moonlight. But it was the creature's proportions that truly marked it as something other than human. Its arms were grotesquely elongated, hanging well past where knees should have been, ending in hands that seemed too large for even its massive frame. The legs, by contrast, were stunted and bent backward at the knee, reminiscent of a dog or wolf's hind legs. If the creature were to stand fully upright on those misshapen limbs, I estimated it would tower to a height of 10 to 14 feet. But perhaps most unsettling was what I couldn't see, its face. Whether by trick of shadow or some quirk of its anatomy, the creature's features were obscured, leaving only a blank expanse where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. In that moment I was grateful for this small mercy, certain that whatever visage lurked in that darkness would have shattered what remained of my sanity. For an eternal moment, the creature remained motionless, its eyeless gaze seeming to bore into me. Then, with a fluidity that belied its misshapen form, it began to move. It didn't charge or attack as I had feared. Instead, it turned and began to climb the wash wall, its movement smooth and practiced. The sight of its climb was perhaps even more terrifying than its initial appearance. It moved with an inhuman grace, its elongated arms and backward bent legs working in perfect harmony as it scaled the near vertical surface. This was no clumsy scramble, but a display of predatory efficiency that chilled me to my core. Its knees never touched the ground, its movement more akin to the unnatural crawl of a horror movie specter than any earthly creature. In a matter of seconds, the creature had crested the wash wall and disappeared into the scrub brush above, leaving no trace of its passage save for the thundering of my heart and the cold sweat that drenched my clothes. The spell of paralysis that had gripped me shattered the moment the creature vanished from sight. I grabbed my cousin's arm, my grip surely tight enough to bruise, and ran. I ran with a speed born of pure terror, dragging my bewildered cousin behind me as I fled back toward the campsite. I have no clear memory of that frenzied flight. My world narrowed to the pounding of my feet against the desert floor and the rasping of my breath in my throat. The wooden sword, which had seemed so reassuring earlier, now felt like a child's toy in my hand, woefully inadequate against the horror we had witnessed. When we finally burst into the circle of light cast by our campfire, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. My family rushed to us, alarmed by our sudden appearance and obvious distress. Between gulps of air, I managed to stammer out a lie about a coyote sighting that had spooked us. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. How could I describe what I had seen? Who would believe such a fantastical tale? Even now, as I write these words, a part of me wants to dismiss it as a trick of moonlight and an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. That creature, whatever it was real. In the days that followed, I found myself jumping at shadows, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I refused to leave the safety of our trailer, much to the confusion and concern of my family. The desert, which had once seemed a place of wonder and adventure, now felt oppressive and threatening. As our camping trip drew to a close, I found myself both relieved to be leaving and oddly reluctant. A part of me, the part that had always loved mysteries and exploration, wanted to return to that wash, to seek answers to the questions that now plagued me. But the memory of that creature's fluid predatory movement was enough to quash any such notions. Since that night, I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find any account that might match what I experienced. I've delved into local folklore, pored over cryptozoology forums, and even reached out to desert ecology experts. While I found plenty of strange tales and unexplained phenomena associated with the Arizona desert, nothing quite matches what I saw. The experience has changed me in ways I'm still coming to terms with. I find myself more cautious now, more aware of the shadows at the edge of perception. The world seems a larger, stranger place than I ever imagined, filled with mysteries that defy easy explanation. But perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: that creature is still out there. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the Arizona desert, it roams free, unseen and unknown by the world at large. And on nights when the moon is full and the desert wind carries the scent of sage and sand, I can't help but wonder, how many others have encountered it? How many have been less fortunate than I was? I may never have answers to these questions, but I share my story now in the hope that it might reach others who have experienced similar encounters. Perhaps together we can shed light on the mysteries that lurk in the shadows of our world. And perhaps in doing so we can be better prepared for the day when those mysteries choose to reveal themselves once more. As for me, I doubt I'll ever look at a desert landscape the same way again. The beauty is still there, but now it's tinged with an awareness of the unknown, of the thin veil that separates the world we think we know from the one that exists just beyond our understanding. And when I find myself in open spaces under a full moon, I can't help but scan the shadows, half expecting to see a tall, misshapen figure loping across the landscape on its backward bent legs. It was a warm summer night, the kind where the air hangs heavy and still, clinging to your skin like an unwelcome embrace. I was about 15 or 16 at the time, walking home from a friend's place with my mate, who I was living with back then. The streets were deserted, bathed in the sickly orange glow of streetlights that seemed to push the darkness back just enough to make the shadows deeper, more menacing. We were in high spirits despite the late hour, or early hour depending on how you look at it. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning, that liminal time when the world seems to hold its breath, caught between one day and the next. My friend was pushing his BMX beside him, the soft click of the freewheel providing a rhythmic backdrop to our laughter and chatter. As we walked, I remember feeling a sense of invincibility that only teenagers possess. The night was ours, the empty streets our playground. We were discussing some inane topic, probably music or girls or both, when something caught my eye. At first, I thought I was seeing things. Maybe it was a trick of the light or my tired mind playing tricks on me. But no, there it was again. 2 shapes, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost unnatural. They were large, much larger than any dog I'd ever seen, and lean, reminding me of greyhounds, but on a scale that didn't seem possible. I nudged my friend, pointing wordlessly. He fell silent mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he too caught sight of the creatures. We watched, transfixed, as they approached a set of mailboxes outside some flats. The mailboxes were substantial, standing about 1.5 meters tall and set back from the road by 5 or 6 meters. What happened next defied all logic and reason. Those 2 massive, dog-like creatures gathered themselves and leaped. But this wasn't just a jump. It was as if they were flying. They cleared those mailboxes in a single bound, sailing through the air with an ease that made my stomach churn. They landed in the middle of the road, barely making a sound despite their size. At that moment, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was very, very wrong. But curiosity overrode my fear, and I kept watching, unable to tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before us. The creatures began to run down the road, their movements fluid and predatory. And then, as if this night couldn't get any more surreal, they changed. It wasn't a gradual transformation. One moment they were running on all fours, and the next they were upright, standing on their hind legs. But they weren't just standing. They were growing, their forms twisting and bulking up until they were unrecognizable from the dog-like shapes they had been moments before. What stood in the road now were 2 massive muscular beings that looked like something out of a nightmare. My mind scrambled for some sort of reference point, something to make sense of what I was seeing. The closest thing I could think of was a Yowie, Australia's equivalent of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but even that comparison fell short. These creatures were like nothing I had ever seen or imagined. They stood there for a moment, their massive forms silhouetted against the streetlights. Then, moving with a speed that belied their size, they took off running. They disappeared around a corner about 200 meters away, in the direction we had come from. My friend and I stood there rooted to the spot. I wanted to run, to hide, to wake up from what surely must be a dream. But I couldn't move. It was as if my body had forgotten how to function, all its energy diverted to trying to process what we had just witnessed. The silence that followed was deafening. The normal sounds of the night, distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, even our own breathing, seemed to have been swallowed up by the impossibility of what we had just seen. And then we heard it. A scream pierced the night, high-pitched and terrified. It sounded like a small child, a little girl perhaps, crying out in absolute terror. The sound chilled me to my core. It was around 3 a.m. There shouldn't have been any children out at this hour. The implications of that scream, combined with what we had just seen, were too horrifying to contemplate. I turned to my friend, seeing my own fear reflected in his wide eyes. Without a word, I jumped onto the handlebars of his BMX. He didn't need any encouragement. He started pedaling as if his life depended on it, and for all we knew, it did. The journey home was a blur. My friend pedaled non-stop for the entire 2 kilometers, the cool night air whipping past us. Every shadow seemed to hide a monster, every sound a potential threat. I kept expecting to feel massive hands grabbing me, pulling me off the bike and into the darkness. When we finally reached home, we practically fell through the door. I slammed it shut behind us, my hands shaking as I turned the lock. We stood there in the hallway, breathing heavily, neither of us willing to break the silence. Finally, needing to confirm that I hadn't gone completely mad, I turned to my friend. What did you see?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He described exactly what I had witnessed. The dog-like creatures, their impossible leap over the mailboxes, their transformation into something much larger and more terrifying. As he spoke, I felt a mix of relief and renewed horror. Relief that I wasn't alone in what I had seen, that I hadn't imagined it, but horror at the confirmation that it had been real. We stayed up for the rest of the night, jumping at every sound, peering nervously out of the windows. When dawn finally broke, it felt like we had survived something monumental, something that had irrevocably changed our understanding of the world. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what we had seen. We looked up local legends, read about cryptid sightings, even considered reporting it to the authorities. But every time we thought about telling someone, we stopped short. Who would believe us? 2 teenagers claiming to have seen monsters in the middle of the night. We did tell a few people over the years, close friends, family members. The reactions were always the same: disbelief, concern, questions about drugs or alcohol. Some laughed it off as a shared hallucination or a vivid dream. Others were more sympathetic but clearly skeptical. But how could 2 people have the exact same hallucination at the exact same time? How could we both dream the same impossible thing? The memory of that night remained crystal clear for both of us, untouched by time or doubt. As the years passed, the experience faded into the background of our lives. We didn't talk about it much, even with each other. It was easier to let it become a strange, shared secret than to continually face the disbelief of others. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the shadows seem a little deeper than usual, I find myself thinking back to that night. I remember the fluid grace of those creatures, the impossible transformation, the terror in that unseen child's scream, and I wonder what else might be out there, moving in the darkness just beyond the reach of our understanding. The summer of '95 stretched before me like an open road. Fresh out of high school, I was drunk on freedom and the promise of adventure. My old friend Tom and I decided on a whim to hit the road, our pockets lined with a measly $140 between us. Back then, it felt like all the money in the world. Our first stop was New Orleans, a city that assaulted our small-town senses with its riotous colors, pungent smells, and cacophony of jazz. The French Quarter was a labyrinth of temptation and sin, and we found ourselves woefully unprepared for its intensity. After a single night of wide-eyed wandering, we retreated to a small town in Mississippi, our tails between our legs. We holed up in a run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The place was a dump, but the air conditioning worked, and in the sweltering heat of a southern summer, that was all that mattered. We spent the night playing cards, sipping cheap vodka that burned our throats, and talking about nothing and everything. As the night wore on and the vodka bottle emptied, our conversation turned to our next move. "Ever been to Texas?" I asked Tom, the words slightly slurred. He shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "Nope. You thinking what I'm thinking?" And just like that, we had a new destination. We consulted our dog-eared road atlas and saw that Marshall, Texas was just across the state line from Shreveport, Louisiana. It seemed as good a place as any to continue our aimless journey. The next morning, nursing hangovers and fueled by gas station coffee, we hit the road. The drive to Shreveport was uneventful, marked only by endless fields of cotton and corn, punctuated by the occasional billboard advertising personal injury lawyers or Jesus. When we reached the city limits, we pulled into a rest area to stretch our legs and make a quick call. We'd promised to check in with our friend Mike, who was covering for us back home. As expected, our mothers had been calling, frantic with worry. We assured Mike we'd be back in a day or two and not to worry. As we were about to leave, something caught our eye, an armadillo, waddling across the parking lot. Now, I'd never seen an armadillo in real life before. To two bored teenagers from up north, this was the height of exotic wildlife. In our infinite wisdom, we decided to try and catch it. What followed was a ridiculous chase around the rest area, the armadillo proving far more agile than its tank-like appearance would suggest. Every time we got close, it would hiss and dart away with surprising speed. After an hour of this futile pursuit, we gave up, sweaty and out of breath. It wasn't until years later that I learned armadillos can carry leprosy. Sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. Shreveport itself was a sobering sight. The city seemed to be decaying before our eyes, a grim monument to faded industry. We crossed a bridge over a river that looked more like an open sewer, its waters an unnatural shade of green. Factory smokestacks belched acrid fumes into the air, creating a haze that hung over everything like a shroud. What struck me most were the people. They seemed worn down, defeated by life in a way I'd never seen before. Many of the children we saw had an odd, vacant look in their eyes. The whole place felt like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie, the set of some southern Gothic nightmare. Eager to leave the oppressive atmosphere behind, we pressed on to Marshall. The small Texas town was a welcome change from Shreveport's industrial decay. We stopped at a barbecue joint, savoring the smoky aroma of slow-cooked meat. Over plates piled high with pulled pork and coleslaw, we studied the map, plotting our route home. We decided to take a scenic detour, heading north on rural Route 43 through Karnak and past Caddo Lake before eventually connecting with Highway 59 towards Texarkana. It was dusk by the time we left Marshall, the setting sun painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples. As we turned onto Route 43, darkness fell quickly. The road was poorly lit, winding through dense forests and rolling hills. Tom was behind the wheel, keeping our speed around 45 miles per hour. Any faster would have been reckless on the twisting road. The night was thick with humidity, the air heavy and still. The smell of pine trees mixed with the earthy scent of the nearby swamps. Crickets and frogs provided a constant background chorus, punctuated occasionally by the hoot of an owl or the rustle of some unseen creature in the underbrush. We drove for what felt like hours without seeing another vehicle. The yellow lines on the road became hypnotic, lulling me into a trance-like state. To stay alert, I rolled down the window and lit a cigarette, letting the cool night air wash over me. Music played softly on the radio, some classic rock station fading in and out of static. I smoked my cigarette absent-mindedly, flicking ashes out the window. As I took one last drag, I tossed the butt out into the darkness. That's when I saw it. In my peripheral vision, I caught a glimpse of something running alongside the car. It was just behind my window, in that space between the edge of the door and where the back window begins. I glanced at the speedometer. We were still doing about 40 miles per hour. I looked over at Tom. He was staring straight ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I turned my gaze forward again, but I could still see it out of the corner of my eye. What I saw defied logic. An enormous muscular arm covered in matted reddish-brown hair was keeping pace with our car. The arm alone was as thick as my torso, rippling with inhuman strength. I slowly rolled up my window, my heart pounding in my chest. Tom increased our speed without a word. The tightness in his jaw told me he was seeing the same thing I was. As we accelerated, the creature seemed to fall behind slightly, but it was still there, running impossibly fast. I forced myself to look directly at the thing chasing us. Its massive chest was higher than the roof of our car. The matted fur was caked with mud and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. As it ran, it leaned forward, and I caught a glimpse of its face. In that moment, all sense of reality shattered. This wasn't some animal or even a person in a costume. This was a monster, a creature that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. Its face was a twisted parody of humanity. The forehead sloped back sharply, giving way to a heavy brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. Those eyes, they were jet black, with pinpricks of red where the pupils should be. They radiated malevolence and hunger. The nose was flat and wide, with flaring nostrils that seemed to be scenting the air. But it was the mouth that truly horrified me. Lips pulled back in a snarl revealed rows of yellow teeth, each as long as my finger and wickedly sharp. Saliva dripped from its jaws as it opened its mouth wider, letting out a roar that was thankfully muffled by the car's windows. "Go faster!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. Tom didn't need to be told twice. He floored the accelerator, and our old car protested as it pushed past 60 miles per hour. The creature was still keeping pace, but it seemed to be tiring. Its breaths came in great heaving gasps, visible in the cold night air. Just when I thought we couldn't go any faster without risking a crash, the road straightened out. Tom pushed the car to its limits, the engine whining in protest. Slowly, agonizingly, we began to pull away from the monster. I kept my eyes glued to the side mirror, watching as the creature fell further and further behind. It let out one final bone-chilling roar before disappearing into the darkness of the forest. We didn't slow down until we reached the outskirts of Texarkana. Even then, we only stopped long enough to fill up the gas tank before continuing our journey home. We drove through the night, neither of us speaking a word about what we'd seen. The sun was rising as we crossed back into our home state. The familiar landscapes should have been comforting, but they felt alien now. How could the world look so normal when we knew what lurked in the shadows? We parted ways with a brief, awkward goodbye. There was an unspoken agreement not to discuss what had happened. Maybe if we didn't talk about it, we could convince ourselves it wasn't real. The next few weeks passed in a haze. I threw myself into preparations for college, desperate for any distraction. But at night, when the house was quiet and dark, the memories would come flooding back. Those eyes, that impossible speed, the primeval terror I'd felt, it all seemed too vivid to be a dream or hallucination. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an escaped zoo animal or a person in an incredibly realistic costume. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't fit. What we'd seen that night was something else entirely, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. As summer faded into fall, I left for college. The bustling campus and rigorous academic schedule provided a welcome respite from my troubled thoughts. I made new friends, joined clubs, and slowly the memory of that night began to fade. Years passed. I graduated, got a job at a small-town newspaper, and settled into a quiet, predictable life. Tom and I had drifted apart, each of us seeming to tacitly understand that maintaining contact would mean acknowledging what we'd seen. It was nearly a decade later when the nightmares started again. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those red eyes and yellow teeth seared into my mind. During the day, I'd find myself jumping at shadows, constantly looking over my shoulder. The breaking point came one night as I was driving home from a late assignment. The road was dark and empty, winding through dense woods. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something at the edge of the trees. For a split second, I saw a flash of reddish-brown fur and the glint of teeth. My heart nearly stopped. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. Hands shaking, I peered into the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me, dredging up old terrors? I sat there for what felt like hours, engine idling, too terrified to move. Finally, a car approached from behind, honking impatiently. The spell broken, I put the car in drive and continued home. But I knew I couldn't go on like this. The next day, I called in sick to work and started researching. I scoured online forums and local legend compilations, looking for any mention of creatures similar to what Tom and I had seen. To my surprise, I found quite a few. There were stories of a Boggy Creek monster in Arkansas, not far from where we'd had our encounter. The descriptions varied, but many mentioned a large, ape-like creature with reddish-brown fur. Some accounts even described it keeping pace with cars on rural roads. I dug deeper, finding similar legends from all over the country. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Fook monster. Different names for what seemed to be the same creature. Most mainstream scientists dismiss these stories as hoaxes or misidentifications of known animals. But after what I'd seen, I wasn't so sure. I reached out to Tom for the first time in years. To my relief, he agreed to meet. We sat in a quiet corner of a local diner, both of us looking older and more worn than I remembered. "You've been having the nightmares too, haven't you?" I asked without preamble. He nodded, his face grim. "I thought I was going crazy. I've never told anyone about that night. I was afraid they'd think I was insane." We spent hours talking, finally giving voice to the terror we'd bottled up for so long. It was cathartic in a way, to know that I wasn't alone in my experiences. As we were about to leave, Tom hesitated. "There's something else," he said, his voice low. "I've seen it again. Not clearly, just glimpses. But I swear it's the same thing." A chill ran down my spine. "Where?" "In the woods behind my house. I hear noises sometimes at night. Branches breaking, something heavy moving around. I've seen eyes reflecting in the darkness, too big to be a deer or bear." I told him about my own recent scare on the road. We both sat in silence for a moment, digesting the implications. Whatever we'd encountered that night in Texas, it wasn't an isolated incident. These things were out there, and for some reason they seemed to be drawn to us. In the years since that conversation, I've become something of an amateur cryptozoologist. I've traveled to alleged Bigfoot hotspots, interviewed witnesses, and pored over grainy photos and shaky video footage. I've never had another clear sighting like that night in Texas, but I've had enough strange experiences to keep me convinced. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization. Most people go through their lives never encountering them, safe in their belief that the world is a known, quantifiable place. But once you've seen what's out there, you can never go back to that comfortable ignorance. I still drive that stretch of rural Route 43 sometimes, usually during the day. The road looks innocent enough in the sunlight, just another winding country lane. But as dusk falls and the shadows lengthen, I can't help but scan the tree line, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. Something large and fast and hungry. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. So if you ever find yourself driving down a lonely road late at night, keep your windows up and your eyes on the road. And if you see something moving in the shadows just beyond the reach of your headlights, don't slow down. Some things are better left in the dark, because the monsters are real, and once they've seen you, they don't forget. My girlfriend and I had always been adventurous souls, seeking out experiences that pushed us beyond our comfort zones. When we decided to embark on a 3-day hike through the dense jungle to reach the ancient Mayan ruins of Tikal, we knew it would be challenging, but we couldn't have anticipated the life-altering events that awaited us. Our journey began with excitement and anticipation. The lush greenery of the jungle enveloped us as we trekked deeper into its heart. The air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of exotic birds and insects created a constant, mesmerizing symphony. We marveled at the towering trees, their canopies stretching far above us, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The first day of hiking was grueling but exhilarating. We navigated winding paths, crossed shallow streams, and climbed over moss-covered logs. By nightfall, we reached the first ranger campsite, a small clearing in the midst of the vast wilderness. We set up our tent, cooked a simple meal over a portable stove, and fell asleep to the gentle rustling of leaves and distant animal calls. The second day brought new challenges. The terrain became more rugged, and the heat more oppressive. We rationed our water carefully, knowing we still had a long way to go. As we pushed on, the sky began to darken ominously. In the distance, we could hear the low rumble of thunder, a warning of the storm to come. We reached the second campsite just as the first raindrops began to fall. Hastily, we erected our tent and secured our belongings. The storm grew in intensity, with flashes of lightning illuminating the jungle in brief, brilliant bursts. We huddled in our tent, listening to the rain pounding against the fabric and the wind howling through the trees. Despite the storm's fury, we eventually drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the day's exertions. But our rest was to be short-lived. At 4 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of male voices outside our tent. In that moment, a primal fear gripped me. We were miles from civilization, vulnerable in the heart of the jungle. Who could be out there in the middle of such a ferocious storm? I whispered to my girlfriend to stay inside the tent, hoping to protect her from whatever danger might be lurking outside. With my heart pounding, I cautiously unzipped the tent flap and stepped out into the rain-soaked night. Through the darkness and the sheets of rain, I could make out 2 figures approaching our campsite. They were carrying rifles, which only heightened my alarm. I stood my ground, trying to project a calm I didn't feel as the men drew closer. To my surprise and slight irritation, I heard the rustle of the tent behind me. My girlfriend had ignored my warning and joined me outside. As she stood beside me, I felt a mixture of fear for her safety and gratitude for her unwavering support. As the men came into clearer view, I realized they were not the threat I had initially feared. They were local hunters, their weathered faces and practical attire speaking to their familiarity with the jungle. They had been caught in the storm and were seeking shelter at the ranger campsite. Relief washed over me, and I found myself inviting them to join us. My girlfriend, always the gracious host even in the most unusual circumstances, offered them coffee. They accepted gratefully, and we huddled under the small awning of the ranger station, the only protection from the relentless rain. As we poured the steaming coffee into tin cups, The storm seemed to gather its strength for one final assault. The wind howled with renewed vigor, and the trees around us groaned under its force. And then, in a moment that will forever be etched in my memory, we heard a deafening crack. Time seemed to slow as we watched a massive tree, its roots finally giving way in the sodden earth, begin to fall. With horrifying clarity, I realized its trajectory. It was headed directly for our tent. The crash was tremendous, the sound of splintering wood and crushed metal reverberating through the clearing. As the dust and debris settled, we stared in shock at the remains of our tent, now flattened beneath the enormous trunk. In that moment, the full weight of what had just happened hit me. If I hadn't woken up to investigate the voices, if my girlfriend had stayed in the tent as I'd asked her to, we would have been crushed. The fine line between life and death had never been so stark. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. In the gray light of morning, we surveyed the damage. Our tent was destroyed, along with most of our supplies. But we were alive, and that fact alone filled us with profound gratitude. The hunters who had unwittingly played a role in saving our lives helped us salvage what we could from the wreckage. They shared their knowledge of the jungle with us, pointing out edible plants and showing us how to find clean water. Their kindness in the face of our misfortune was deeply touching. With their guidance, we were able to complete our journey to Tikal. As we stood among the ancient ruins, looking out over the vast expanse of jungle that had nearly claimed our lives, we felt a sense of awe and humility. The power of nature, the fragility of life, and the unexpected kindness of strangers had all come together in the experience that would forever change us. The hike back was challenging, but we faced it with a new perspective. Every step, every breath felt like a gift. We had stared death in the face and emerged not just alive, but with a deeper appreciation for the unpredictability and preciousness of life. Returning home, we found ourselves changed. The modern world, with its comforts and conveniences, seemed both welcoming and strangely foreign. We carried with us not just memories, but life lessons etched into our very being. We learned that danger can come in many forms, and that sometimes what seems threatening at first can be your salvation. We learned the importance of trusting our instincts, but also of remaining open to the unexpected. And perhaps most importantly, we learned that in the face of nature's awesome power, human kindness and connection can make all the difference. To this day, the sound of rain on a tent brings back vivid memories of that night in Guatemala. But along with the fear, I feel a profound sense of gratitude for the strangers who became saviors, for the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, and for the chance to continue living and appreciating every moment. The summer of 1990 was supposed to be a time of freedom and adventure for me and my younger brother. After our parents' divorce the previous year, we had been sent to spend the entire break with our father and his new wife in the suburbs of St. Louis. To two city kids like us, the sprawling woods and hidden corners of our apartment complex felt like a playground just waiting to be explored. Our building was tucked away at the very back of the property, with another apartment block situated diagonally across from us. To the south, a small ravine snaked through a dense thicket of trees, while to the north lay a vast, untamed woodland that stretched the length of the complex. This is where my brother, our friend Paul, and I spent hour upon endless hour, building forts, playing elaborate games of tag, and engaging in an ever-escalating prank war with the kids from the neighboring building. Looking back, I can't help but feel a chill of dread at how carefree and reckless we were in those halcyon days. We had no idea of the horrors that lurked just beyond the tree line, waiting to prey upon unsuspecting children like ourselves. It was during one of our expeditions into the woods that we stumbled upon what can only be described as a makeshift camp, a ramshackle structure of rotting wood and tattered tarps. At first, The discovery filled us with a sense of excitement. The prospect of a new secret hideaway was too tempting for our young, adventurous minds to resist. But as I stood watch, a prickling sensation crept up the back of my neck, a primal warning that something was terribly, horribly wrong. I begged my brother and Paul to leave, to turn back and forget we had ever seen the wretched thing, but they brushed off my pleas, dismissing me as a fearful coward. Reluctantly, I allowed them to venture inside, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited, every nerve ending on high alert. The sounds that eventually drifted out to me, the muffled cries, the scuffling, the unmistakable thud of fist against flesh, were enough to turn my blood to ice. I wanted to run, to scream, to somehow alert the adults, but a paralyzing terror had seized me, rendering me utterly helpless as my brother and our friend were subjected to unspeakable horrors within that vile makeshift shelter. When they finally emerged, their clothes disheveled and their faces pale with shock, I could scarcely recognize them. In that moment, I knew that our childhood innocence had been irrevocably shattered, that the world we had once seen as a wondrous playground had revealed its true, monstrous face. We fled back to our apartment, locking the door behind us and drawing the curtains, as if that simple barrier could shield us from the darkness that had infiltrated our lives. My brother and I huddled together on the couch, our hearts racing, our minds reeling with the horrific images seared into our memories. We dared not speak, for fear that the very sound of our voices might somehow draw the attention of the evil that lurked just beyond our walls. As the night wore on, the shadows seemed to lengthen, the silence becoming increasingly oppressive. Every creak, every whisper of the wind, sent fresh spikes of terror coursing through our veins. We clung to each other, desperate for the comfort and reassurance that only a sibling's love can provide, praying that morning would come and deliver us from this waking nightmare. But the respite we so desperately craved never arrived. Instead, the darkness seemed to seep in, consuming every inch of our sanctuary, until we were left gasping for air, our lungs burning with the weight of our own terror. The figure we had glimpsed in the woods now materialized before us, its menacing silhouette looming ever closer, its malevolent gaze piercing through the gloom. I can still feel the icy grip of those hands, the acrid stench of its foul breath as it descended upon us, its twisted, inhuman features etched into my mind with indelible clarity. The screams that tore from our throats were muffled, swallowed by the suffocating darkness, as we fought with every ounce of our strength against the relentless onslaught of our attacker. Time seemed to stand still, the seconds stretching into an eternity of pure, unadulterated horror. I thought we were going to die, that the darkness would claim us, swallowing us whole and leaving no trace of our existence. But just as all hope seemed to fade, a glimmer of light pierced the veil, the sound of sirens cutting through the oppressive silence. The relief that washed over us was both exhilarating and profoundly unsettling. We had been so close to the precipice, teetering on the edge of oblivion, and the knowledge that we had stared into the abyss and lived would forever haunt us. As the police swarmed the apartment, apprehending the malevolent figure that had terrorized us, I held my brother tight, whispering words of comfort and reassurance, even as my own heart threatened to burst from my chest. We were alive, but at what cost? The innocence we had once possessed had been brutally, irrevocably torn from us, leaving behind a void that would never be filled. In the days and weeks that followed, we were interrogated, our every word and action scrutinized as the authorities attempted to piece together the full extent of the horrors we had endured. The trauma we had suffered manifested in myriad ways: sleepless nights, crippling anxiety, a deep, abiding mistrust of the world around us. Our father and stepmother, though well-intentioned, struggled to understand the depths of our anguish, their attempts to comfort us often falling flat in the face of our overwhelming grief and fear. We had been thrust into a realm of darkness that they could scarcely comprehend, and the gulf that separated us only served to deepen our isolation. As I grew older, the memory of that fateful summer night never truly faded. It haunted me, a constant, unwelcome companion that lurked in the shadows of my mind, ready to pounce at the slightest provocation. The world I had once viewed as a place of wonder and possibility had been irrevocably tainted, and I found myself driven to uncover the truth, to understand the nature of the evil that had so profoundly shattered our lives. It was this quest for answers, this burning need to ensure that no one else would suffer as we had, that led me to a career in law enforcement. I dedicated myself to the pursuit of justice, driven by the ghosts of my past and the unwavering determination to protect the innocent from the darkness that had once threatened to consume us. And yet, even as I rose through the ranks, even as I bore witness to the darkest corners of humanity, a part of me remained forever trapped in that fateful summer, a child once more, clinging to the tattered remnants of a lost innocence. The scars, both physical and emotional, would never truly heal, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the ever-present danger that lurks in the shadows. As I sit here, reflecting on the events of that long-ago summer, I am struck by the realization that the true power of our story lies not in the horror we endured, but in the resilience and strength that we, as children, were able to muster in the face of such overwhelming adversity. It is a testament to the indomitable spirit of youth, to the bonds of family and friendship that can transcend even the darkest of circumstances. And so, I share this tale, not as a cautionary warning, but as a reminder that even in the depths of darkness, the human spirit can find a way to prevail. For within each of us, no matter our age or our circumstances, lies a wellspring of courage, a reservoir of resilience that can be tapped into when the need arises. It is my hope that by sharing this story, I can inspire others to never underestimate the power of their own inner strength, to embrace the darkness with a steadfast determination to emerge into the light stronger and wiser than before. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. My girlfriend and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and immerse ourselves in nature. We were in our mid-20s, full of energy and enthusiasm for new experiences. As we unloaded our gear from the trunk, I couldn't help but smile at the eclectic mix of items we'd brought along. Alongside the usual camping essentials, tent, sleeping bags, cookware, were an assortment of what some might call hippie toys. Juggling bags, a Diablo, and poi nestled among our backpacks, a testament to our love for creative expression and playful arts. But the items I was most excited about were tucked carefully into a padded bag, our brass singing bowls. We had 3 of them, each a different size and producing its own unique tone. The middle-sized green bowl was our favorite, its melodious ring seeming to resonate with something deep within us both. As we set up camp, the late afternoon sun filtered through the pine trees, casting long shadows across our chosen site. The spot was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a babbling stream nearby providing a soothing background melody to our activities. Once the tent was erected and our sleeping area prepared, we spent some time exploring our surroundings. The mountain air was invigorating, filled with the scent of pine and wild herbs. We collected some dry wood for our campfire, careful to follow proper forest etiquette and only take what was already fallen. As twilight descended, we lit our fire and prepared a simple but satisfying meal of campfire roasted vegetables and canned soup. The flames danced before us, their warmth a welcome comfort as the temperature began to drop with the setting sun. After dinner, we couldn't resist breaking out our toys. We juggled and spun poi, our laughter echoing through the trees as we fumbled and occasionally succeeded in our attempts. As the night grew darker, we decided to end our evening with a more meditative activity, playing our singing bowls. We carefully unpacked the bowls, setting them on a flat rock near our campfire. I picked up the green bowl, our favorite, and began to play. The process of coaxing sound from a singing bowl is an art in itself. It requires a delicate touch, a steady hand, and patience. I ran the striker around the rim of the bowl, gradually increasing pressure and speed until a clear, pure tone emerged. The sound seemed to hang in the air, mingling with the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of night birds. My girlfriend took her turn next, and we spent a peaceful hour taking turns with the bowls, letting their vibrations wash over us and connect us more deeply to our surroundings. As the fire burned down to embers, we retired to our tent, feeling relaxed and at peace with the world. Sleep came quickly, aided by the fresh air and physical exertion of the day. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I was suddenly jolted awake. At first I couldn't identify what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of our green singing bowl. My heart began to race. I knew my girlfriend was still beside me in the tent. I could hear her breathing quicken as she too awoke to the sound. We lay there, frozen, as the pure tone of the bowl rang out through the night air. The sound was perfect, clearer and more resonant than we had ever managed to produce ourselves. It rose and fell in a way that seemed almost melodic, as if the bowl was being played by a master musician. My girlfriend nudged me gently, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. I nodded, acknowledging that I too was hearing the impossible sound. We both knew that singing bowls don't play themselves. They require human touch, skill, and effort to produce even the simplest of tones. Yet here was our bowl, singing of its own accord in the middle of the night. We lay there barely breathing for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 3 or 4 minutes. The bowl's song continued, unabated, filling the night with its ethereal tone. Finally, moving with exaggerated slowness, we began to inch towards the tent's entrance. Our plan, communicated through silent glances and subtle gestures, was to unzip the flap just enough to peer out and see what or who was playing our bowl. But the moment we started to move, the sound stopped. It wasn't a gradual fade or a slowing of tempo. The tone cut off abruptly, as if someone had grabbed the bowl and forcefully muted it. The sudden silence was almost as startling as the unexpected music had been. We froze again, straining our ears for any sound of movement outside the tent. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling of leaves, not even the snap of a twig. Just the ordinary sounds of the forest at night. After a few moments of tense silence, we burst out of the tent, flashlights in hand. We swept the beams of light across our campsite, searching for any sign of an intruder. But everything was exactly as we had left it. The bowl sat undisturbed on its rock, our other camping gear untouched. We expanded our search, looking for footprints or any other signs that someone had been in our camp. But the ground was dry and hard-packed, revealing nothing. We even checked the perimeter of our clearing, but found no evidence that anyone had entered or left. Bewildered and more than a little unnerved, we returned to the bowl. I picked it up, examining it closely in the beam of my flashlight. It was cool to the touch, showing no signs of having been recently played. I ran the striker around its rim, but could only produce the usual tentative wobbling tone that comes from an unpracticed hand. We stayed up for the rest of the night, too keyed up to sleep. We talked in low voices, trying to rationalize what we had heard. Could it have been an animal, somehow producing that pure tone? But how? Could it have been the wind, perhaps catching the bowl at just the right angle? But the night was still, with barely a breeze. As the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, we were no closer to an explanation. We packed up our camp in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. The magic of the previous evening had been replaced by a sense of unease, a feeling that we had brushed up against something beyond our understanding. On the drive home, we tried to process the experience. We agreed that whatever had played our bowl hadn't felt malevolent. If anything, it had seemed curious, perhaps even playful. But it clearly hadn't wanted to be seen or identified. In the years since that camping trip, we've told this story many times. We've researched similar experiences, looked into the folklore of the area, and even consulted with experts on acoustic phenomena. But we've never found a satisfactory explanation for what happened that night. We still have the green singing bowl. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the mood is right, one of us will take it out and play it. And as the tone rings out, I can't help but remember that night in the mountains and wonder about the mysterious musician who joined us for a brief magical moment. The experience changed us in subtle ways. We became more open to the idea that there are things in this world that defy easy explanation. It deepened our appreciation for the mysteries of nature and the power of music. And it gave us a story that, even years later, never fails to send a shiver down our spines and raise the hair on our arms. We've returned to those mountains many times since, always bringing the green bowl with us. We've never experienced anything quite like that night again, but every time we play the bowl under the stars, there's a part of us that hopes and fears that we might once again hear that perfect, unexplainable tone ringing out through the night.